All right guys, so it's a little hard to believe that it's been another year since my last shop tour video, but a lot has changed here in the shop since then, so I figured why not do another tour video since you guys seem to enjoy it. But before we jump in case you guys are new here, let me just give you some specs of the building. This is my dream shop. I bought it, I think about 4 years ago now, and this place is pretty massive. So the footprint of the main building is about 4,000 square feet. There is an apartment space where the previous owner used to live. That's about 1,000 square feet of that 4,000. And then the rest of it is the shop space. When I bought this place, I never thought that 3,000 square feet could feel small, but let me tell you, I think we as humans have the tendency to fill whatever space with stuff, and I have definitely done that. So this front area is kind of what I call my lumber storage and receiving area where I get any of my big freight shipments. But recently it's also been pulling kind of double duty as the set, if you will, for the woodworking course I've been working on, Jumpstart Your Woodworking. Because it's a beginner woodworking course, I didn't want to show the rest of my shop. I figured that would be kind of an intimidating thing for people who are getting into woodworking. And so I filmed those videos with a pretty basic tool set in front of this garage door just to hopefully make it more approachable. So one of the new additions to the shop this year is right here behind me, this workbench, which I built as part of that course. This is a really cool workbench because it was a pretty approachable build, but I think it's a great workbench. I've been using it a lot over the past couple of months as I've worked on other projects, and to be honest, it's really surprisingly good considering how much it cost to build and the tools I built it with. And I have some very expensive workbenches to compare this workbench against, and I think this thing holds its own pretty well. Also up here is the job site table saw I used for some of those more beginner friendly projects. This is the SawStop job site saw, and I think this is probably one of the nicer job site table saws on the market. It's got a good fence, it's got a great mobile base so you can easily roll it up and tuck it out of the way if you're not using it. So if you're working in a smaller shop space, I would definitely recommend this particular saw or something similar to it. So I guess from here, let's continue on back to another big new addition to the shop, my new miter saw station. So this miter saw station was another huge upgrade to the shop this year. If you guys have been following me for a longer time, you'll know that previous to this, I'd built a version of the J. Bates miter saw station, and that was one of the first shop projects I ever did like 9 years ago at this point, and it definitely showed. I definitely didn't have the building skills that I have today back when I built that thing, and I figured it was time for an upgrade. And overall, I think this new miter saw station turned out amazing. It's got a ton of storage built in. I think it looks really nice. That was definitely one of the goals of the project. The cabinetry is definitely a lot better built. I love all of the soft close undermount drawer slides. It's really cool to have an integrated trash and then scrap bin here in the miter saw station because that's one of those things that you just use all the time when you're working at this kind of setup. I also upgraded to a new Makita miter saw as part of that project. I'm still kind of testing the waters with this thing. Overall, I think it works well. One thing I'll say is that the dust collection was not all that it was, I think, sold to be. The dust collection on this saw still doesn't compare to something like a Festool Capex, so I am probably going to be enclosing this area and adding some sort of dust collection to add another way to capture that miter saw dust, which is one of the hardest things to deal with in a woodworking shop. And thankfully, I planned for that and left this upper cabinet above the miter saw open so that I could put a dust hood in here and hook it up to my dust collection system, and hopefully that will improve the overall dust collection. And I should mention that I do have plans for this miter saw station, and that includes both this full 12-foot long version you see here, but then also a shortened 8-foot long version, because I made this in a way where all of the cabinets are modular, so you could really add on or shrink this down as much as you wanted to fit your space. So I'll link to those below, and I'm not going to mention it over and over again throughout this video, but if you see something in this shop tour that was custom built, I probably have a set of plans for it, so I'll link to all the ones I mentioned down in the video description below. So I guess from here, let's rotate around and we can take a look at one of the most used tools in my shop, the table saw. So my table saw is probably one of the older tools that I have here in the shop. I've had this thing since my first shop, and I really don't see much of a reason to upgrade. This is the 5 horsepower SawStop ICS. It's an excellent table saw. It's super accurate. Obviously, it has the safety functionality of the SawStop built in, and so I really don't think there's much else I would want out of a table saw. I thought about buying a sliding table saw for the shop, but with the way this is configured, I think it would kind of run into this wall over here. Plus, I want want my projects to be at least slightly accessible to you guys. So if I added another more specialty tool to my arsenal, I think it would just further create a disconnect between the projects I can build and the projects that are realistic for you guys to build. That said, I have added a few new accessories to the table saw that I haven't even, I don't think, shown in any videos yet because I've been working on that job site table saw. One of those accessories are these rollers from Jessam. I think these are going to be super helpful when I'm doing things like working with sheet goods because these rollers help to guide your workpiece up tight against the fence, and I think they should just make the table saw a little easier to use. I've also recently added a few new miter gauges because I want to do some tests and kind of compare some of the miter gauges that are available out there, because that is one of those things that I think is pretty essential for any cabinet saw. And both of those are fairly expensive, but I think they're the kind of thing that you're going to use day in and day out on every project. And especially if you work with a lot of angles and things like that, I think having a good quality miter gauge is going to be extremely useful. But I think one of the biggest things that's changed about my table saw setup is on the other side of my table saw, and let's bring you guys around so you can check that out. So this is my new outfeed table. This was another big project from this past year, and overall I gotta say I love this thing. It is so nice having a much bigger outfeed table. That way I can rip down longer parts without them flopping off the end. It's also a great kind of second or third workbench or work surface. I think it looks really cool. I use this fancy Phoenix laminate on the top. I built the base out of soft maple. It's got undermount drawer slides, and overall this thing is just a massive upgrade from my previous outfeed table, which is something I just kind of slapped together when I moved into my last shop space. Behind me is another structure I brought over from my old shop and is probably about due for an upgrade. It's my plywood scrap storage. And obviously with the cost of plywood these days, I am definitely a lot less likely to just toss out scraps. So I find myself hoarding more and more scraps as the years go on, but it's getting a little bit out of control. And obviously that thing is overflowing with scraps. So I probably need to figure out a better storage solution there. Moving on down this back wall from my plywood scrap storage is my dust collector, which you might have seen if you followed along with my shop renovation series, is housed in a soundproof closet. And this has been a huge upgrade to the overall quality of working in this shop. This particular dust collector, which is made by Clearview, is just deafeningly loud. So if you happen to have a really loud dust collector like I do and can frame out a little room or closet around it, I would highly recommend it. And I've done multiple tests with an anemometer, and it doesn't seem to make any difference whether the door to the closet is open or closed on the performance of the dust collector. So overall, I think that was a huge win. So I guess from here, let's continue on down this right wall of the shop into my larger plywood storage area and then my CNC room. So as I mentioned, this is my kind of larger plywood storage area. This is a pallet rack, obviously. And so my vision for this was to have a bunch of plywood kind of stocked up, ready to go onto the CNC. But as you can probably see, I've been working through that plywood a lot more than I've been buying it. So it's probably time to re-up on some plywood here. Over here to my right is kind of a newer setup. This is something that kind of became a necessity when I bought that huge pile of black walnut from my buddy Jamie Perkins from the Perkins Builder Brothers. So all that walnut came in the format of slabs, and all of those slabs are 8/4 or just under 2 inches thick. And so obviously that's great for things like tabletops or desktops or anything where you need that thicker material. But in a lot of projects, you don't need that thicker material. You really want 4/4 material. So I found myself having to resaw a lot of that material. But unfortunately, if I try to do that in the middle of a project, I've been running into a lot of issues with cupping. So what I've decided to start doing is planning my projects a little bit further out and then resawing that material kind of way before I need it, just so it has time to rest and kind of get any of that wood movement out of its system so it can kind of settle out. So this is all the material I'm gonna need for this live edge dresser project I have coming up. And as you can see, I have some weights on top of it just to help keep it flat as it's acclimating to my shop space. And then I also have stickers between each layer of wood, again, just to allow airflow evenly through this whole stack so that I can hopefully avoid some of that cupping that I ran into on some of my previous projects. Then here behind me is my CNC room, and really not much has changed there in the last year. I haven't even really used my CNC for that many projects this year, and a lot of that is because it's kind of a fine balance on YouTube. You get a lot of people complaining in the comments if you use your CNC too much, which is kind of aggravating because I really enjoy using my CNC, but at the same time, obviously, if nobody watches my videos, I can't do this as a business. So I try to use it for things that could easily be done by other tools, and I think so far that seems to be working out. So that does it for this wall. So I guess let's turn around and take a little detour into the kind of office kitchen area just so you guys can see that, and then continue on to the rest of the woodworking stuff. So this hot mess is my living slash kitchen slash office space. It's really a catch-all and is a complete mess. As you can see, you might remember I built that shiplap wall with the secret bookcase here. And behind this wall is where a lot of my networking and smart home equipment is located. So one thing I've been focused on this year is improving the security here at the shop, just because I'm not here all the time. And I've been using Eufy, the sponsor of this week's video's cameras here at the shop, for years, but they just came out with this new NVR system, which is perfect for my shop. So an NVR, or network video recorder, records 24/7, so I never miss anything happening here at the shop. And this Eufy NVR comes with a 2 terabyte hard drive, but it can be expanded to hold up to 16 terabytes of footage. So I set up the NVR here in my networking closet, and after connecting it to my TV through HDMI, I could get the camera set up. And I installed 2 of Eufy's S4 Max PoE cameras outside the shop, and these things are amazing. Each camera has 2 different lenses, one fixed wide-angle lens which can capture a larger area, plus a second PTZ or pan tilt zoom lens, which uses local AI to track things like people, cars, and animals. And this makes sure the camera captures anything on my property and pretty much eliminates blind spots. And these cameras are even able to talk to each other through the NVR and cross-track subjects between the cameras, which I think is pretty darn cool. To install the cameras, I needed to run an Ethernet cable to each one. And thankfully, the installation process is really simple and would be a piece of cake for most DIYers. And the awesome thing about using these S4 cameras in this kind of PoE setup is that it's like having 2 cameras on each Ethernet connection, which meant I only needed to run 2 cables to get 4 separate camera feeds. I also installed 2 of these E41 cameras inside the shop, one inside the garage door, and another one here in the living room, and these 2 cameras will cover the 2 main entry points for intruders. Once the cameras were installed, I could set up everything here on the NVR, and as you can see, it's super easy to switch between the different cameras and view all of the captured events. The NVR also has a smart video search functionality where I can easily filter between different types of events instead of having to scrub through hours of footage like with a traditional NVR system. I can also manage everything from my phone, which is a huge bonus when I'm away from the shop. Overall, I think this Eufy NVR system is going to be a huge upgrade to my shop security. And if you'd like to learn more, click the link in the description below to check out the different Eufy PoE NVR kit options to find the perfect system for your place. Thanks again to Eufy for sponsoring this week's video, and let's get back to the shop tour. So then coming out of the office and then coming down the right wall of the shop, the first thing we come to is what I like to call the triangle of milling. So my table saw is right here, which we already talked about. Then I've got my jointer and my planer behind me. And so these 3 tools, if you're working with rough lumber, are going to be some of the most frequently used tools in your shop. And so I always try to lay out my shop so that these 3 tools are arranged in a way that makes them really easy to go in between. Because the last thing I think you'd want would be to have your jointer way across the shop from your planer, because then you're going to be making a ton of trips back and forth during the milling process. As far as the specifics on these machines, they haven't really changed. These are the same tools I had in my last shop. I've got a 12-inch joiner and a 20-inch planer. They both have helical heads, so the surface finish coming off of these tools is really, really impressive, and honestly, I can't really see much of a reason why I would want to upgrade from either of these machines. Also in this area is my drum sander, which is a tool I really don't use that much. Not a big fan of this particular drum sander. Changing the belts is a royal pain. It seems like every time I do it, I end up with part of the belt overlapping. So I'm probably going to be selling this machine and trying to find another drum sander that I maybe like a little better.
God dang it, dude. Still there's your art. Forgot how annoying this is.
All right, I'm not dealing with it. Not dealing with it. Oh my God. But anyway, from here, let's continue on along this wall where I have my router table and bandsaw set up. So the next tools along this wall are my router table and then my bandsaws. And I think both of these tools are great candidates for keeping up against a wall. And if you need to move them out away from the wall when you're working on longer pieces, it's very easy to do as long as you have a mobile base on your machines. And that's something I guess I haven't mentioned up until this point. I have all of my tools, pretty much all of my tools, on mobile bases, and the ones that aren't on mobile bases can easily be moved around with my pallet jack. And I think keeping everything in your shop mobile is a very good idea because you never know when you're going to be working on a larger project where you might need to move some of your tools around. And let me tell you, some of these larger machines get really, really heavy, so moving them around without some kind of mobile base would be next to impossible. Anyway, this router table is a project I built at my last shop. It is still serving me very well. I've got a cast iron top. I built the base out of some Baltic birch plywood. One huge upgrade I added when I built this router table was this power feeder. And I think out of all the router table accessories I've ever used, this is one of the most handy. And the nice thing about a power feeder is, in addition to feeding your workpiece at a very consistent rate, it also keeps even pressure on your workpiece, so that if you're adding something like an edge profile or a dado or really kind of anything on the router, you're going to end up with a perfectly even cut across the entire piece. So then next to my router table, I have my bandsaws, and I added this second bandsaw to the shop, I think last year. And basically I wanted to have one bandsaw set up permanently with a big resaw blade, because I'm doing a lot of resawing these days. And then I can keep my other bandsaw set up with a smaller blade, which will be great for cutting curves. And you might notice a third bandsaw there in the background, an antique bandsaw, and that is not actually mine. My buddy Josh is storing that here for the time being, but that is a really cool piece. I don't really know much of the history of the machine, but I think it's well over 100 years old. It doesn't currently run. I have no idea what kind of motor was hooked up to this thing, or if it was steam powered, or who knows, but it definitely looks really cool in the background of my videos. But anyway, I think that covers all the tools on this wall, so let's turn around to my woodworking platform, as I call it, and check out some of my workbenches and assembly tables. So if you guys have been watching my videos for a while, you'll definitely recognize this setup. This is my main kind of, I guess, set, if you will. This is my Joe Berg's workbench, and then my French cleat wall, which is another relic from my first shop, and is definitely something I'm planning to kind of rebuild in the coming year. And I'm definitely not getting rid of French cleat. I absolutely love this kind of setup. I think it's great to be able to build your own tool holders to store exactly what you want to store. I've tried all kinds of different pegboard and other storage systems, and I keep coming back to French cleat as the most versatile. We as woodworkers can obviously build out these kind of setups very easily and completely customize them to our needs, and I just think it's pretty hard to beat. But my plan is, instead of having this panelized setup, I want to have a full run of French cleats around this entire woodworking platform, and that'll give me a lot more flexibility with all the stuff I am storing on the walls here, because as you probably know, once you screw something to the wall, it feels very permanent compared to something like a French cleat, where you can just pick it up and move it around as you add new tools to your arsenal. And that's one thing with my shop, is I am constantly getting new stuff, whether that's stuff being sent to me or purchasing tools or whatever. I think I just love trying out new tools and testing them out and seeing how they can improve my workflow. And so I've come to realize over the years that the more flexibility I can build into these storage solutions I build for my shop, the better. But that pretty much covers this area, so let's keep turning around and check out my assembly table and my drill press. So over in this corner, I have some various hardware storage, including a lot of the more mechanic style tools I use. Then I have my drill press, which hasn't really changed since my first shop. This is the Nova Voyager, I think. This drill press is awesome. It is a direct drive drill press rather than a belt driven drill press, which means you can change speeds on the fly just by turning a knob. And this makes dialing in the correct RPM based on the size of your drill bit incredibly easy, compared to the old style of having to drop the motor, move a belt, retighten the motor, all while having to reference a belt chart, usually on the lid of the motor enclosure. This is a much better system. But then continuing around over to my left, we've got my assembly table, which is another very old project and something that continues to serve me well in my woodworking. It has storage for a ton of my sustainers for all my different festival stuff. I also kind of refurbished this thing a couple years ago and set up a couple of the drawers with the 3D printed Gridfinity system. So that's where I have a lot of my screws and things like that I use on my projects organized. Next to my assembly table is my Festool dust extractor with the boom arm, and this thing is really handy. If you've used Festool stuff before, you'll know that one of the best parts of their system is the fact that the power cords are detachable, and so that means I can very quickly switch between something like my domino to a router to a sander to a jigsaw, all without having to move the actual power cord, and it just really makes things very efficient. That being said, I am starting to get a little bit annoyed by the boom arm itself. I don't know if it's just showing its age, but it's starting to just kind of swing on its own, and it's gotten a little bit tippy over the years. And so I'm actually considering building out something similar to my buddy John from Lincoln Street Woodworks, basically a shop-made boom arm that could mount to a wall, or in my case, I've got some I-beam running throughout the shop. And I just think it's gonna be a lot better than this system because it's just kind of flimsy. It's not really that high. I don't know, I just don't love it. So stay tuned for that project. But so I guess from here we can keep swinging around and we can talk about my lift top assembly table and some of my new and improved clamp storage. So then last but not least, as far as the work surfaces in this woodworking platform area, is my lift top assembly table. And I think this has become one of my all-time favorite things in my shop. So in case you guys missed that project, I built out this large kind of torsion box style top on top of a hydraulic lift table. And that means I can raise and lower the surface of the assembly table depending on the project I'm working on. And as you guys probably know, if you're working on something really tall, it's pretty awkward if you're working on a standard workbench. So being able to drop that down so I can actually see what I'm doing is super handy. And the same goes for smaller projects. I can lift the table up if my back's starting to get sore or something like that. The one thing you do lose is the storage below the table. So I realize that this could probably be a little bit difficult in smaller shops because obviously you need to maximize storage in those kind of spaces. But otherwise, I think this is a great addition to pretty much any shop, especially if you work on a lot of cabinetry. Next to the dust collector is this rolling clamp storage rack from Rockler, and I've had this thing for a couple years, but I haven't had it set up because I had all my clamps on my French cleat wall and I didn't really feel like I needed to move them. But after working in this larger shop space and carrying clamps back and forth, 30, 40 feet on every project, I realized it'd be a lot better to have a more mobile solution so that I can bring my clamps to whichever work surface I happen to be working on. Because on any given project, I might be working on this lift top assembly table, my workbench, my other assembly table, the outfit table. And so as you can imagine, moving all of these heavy clamps between each of them can be a huge waste of time. This obviously wouldn't be as big of a deal in a smaller shop because you just have less steps to take, but that's one of the things I'm starting to realize when working in this larger shop space is I really need to focus on the efficiency of tool retrieval because I can easily do 10,000 steps in a day inside this shop, which is pretty insane. That's over 5 miles of walking just working on a project. And so I think focusing on reconfiguring where I store certain things and where I work on certain types of tasks could really help with that efficiency. On the wall next to that mobile clamp rack are some tool storage accessories from Proper Tool Co. And they sent me some stuff to check out, and I'm really impressed with the quality on a lot of these items. It's been really nice to be able to store some of my newer Makita stuff. So I think that pretty much covers the woodworking platform. So now let's spin around and go check out my metalworking room / spray booth / storage unit right now, and the addition, which is kind of more deep storage for tools and supplies that I don't use as regularly. So this part of my shop is probably the part that gets the least screen time, and that's because a lot of it is really just storage. So over here to my right is where I store all of my finishing supplies and epoxies and all that kind of stuff. I have a flammables cabinet for any of my oil-based stuff, and then I have another cabinet for any of my water-based finishes and those epoxies. Then over here to my left is the metalworking / spray booth room, and as I mentioned, this has kind of become just a storage area, and that's been especially true lately because I've been trying to sort through some of my tools and figure out the stuff that I can get rid of, because as I mentioned earlier in this video, honestly, I have accumulated way too much stuff over the last couple of years, especially during the tiny house build and the shop renovation. There were a lot of tools I added to my arsenal that aren't really things that I'm using very much anymore now that I'm not doing as much construction type of work. And so I want to announce the first ever Crafted Workshop garage sale. And so as you guys might remember, I tried to do one of these last year, but then Asheville got hit by the biggest natural disaster I think it's ever seen. So I had to cancel that because there was a ton of damage to the infrastructure here in Asheville. Thankfully, over the last year, a lot of that has been fixed. And so now, fingers crossed, I want to try to have another garage sale. I'll try to get pictures of a lot of the items I'm going to be selling and put them up on my website ahead of time, just so you guys know what's going to be offered. But in case you guys are interested in coming and hanging out and checking out the shop, and hopefully I'll try to get some of my other local YouTube buddies to come hang out as well. I'll have links to a ticketing system in the video description below, and it's not going to cost anything to attend. I just want to get an idea of how many people might show up so I can figure out things like parking and food and drinks and that kind of stuff. So again, that'll be linked below. The tools will be at a very good discount, and you guys can help me out by clearing out some of my shop space. Hopefully you guys can put some of these tools to use. But anyway, after that garage sale, hopefully this spray booth area will be a little bit more cleaned out. It would be nice to get that room a little bit more useful by decluttering it. And speaking of clutter, the kind of last space here on the ground level is the addition, which, as I mentioned, is pretty much just deep storage for things that I don't use regularly. I also have a home gym setup in there that I haven't touched in probably a year, so also need to sell that. And that's also where all my utilities come in. So I have my main electrical panel and all that kind of stuff in there. And then I don't think I'm going to take you guys up to the attic this time because it is blazing hot up there in the middle of summer. Nothing's changed. It's still a dark, dusty mess up there. So really not much to see. I don't have any immediate plans to finish out that space because honestly, it's just going to cost a ton of money, and I'm not sure I want to make that investment right now. So if you guys have any questions about some details or maybe some tools I didn't cover, feel free to leave them in the comments below. I try to respond to every single comment that I get. Also, I have links to most of the tools I talked about in the video description below in case you want to check those out. And last, if it's your first time here, go ahead and get subscribed and ring that notification bell so you don't miss my future videos. All right, thanks for watching, y'all, and until next time, happy building.